The invoice arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under Margaret Chun's door like a coiled snake. $3,000 for unauthorized use of HOA water resources and dam maintenance fees. Margaret, 62 years old and a retired civil engineer, who'd spent 35 years designing infrastructure for the Army Corps of Engineers. Read the document 3 times before the absurdity fully registered. The Clearwater Estates HOA, led by President Patricia "Patty" Drummond, was billing her for the stone dam that created the small lake behind her property. The dam Margaret's grandfather had built in 1947. The dam that sat entirely on Margaret's 5-acre lot. The dam that existed 73 years before this planned community was even conceived. Margaret set down her coffee, pulled out the original property deed from her filing cabinet, and smiled the way she used to smile before presenting findings that would end a contractor's career. Patty Drummond had no idea she'd just picked a fight with someone who memorized water rights law during her thesis defense 40 years ago. But today, everything was about to change. Where are you from? Tell us in the comments below. And if you're loving this story of justice served, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales of karma and revenge. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Now, let's see exactly how this unfolded. This is a story in 3 parts. The violation that pushed a good person too far. The confrontation where power shifted completely. And the resolution where justice was finally served in the most satisfying way imaginable. Margaret had moved into her grandfather's old farmhouse after retiring, seeking peace after decades of high-pressure government work. The property had been in her family since 1945, passed down through 3 generations. When developers built Clearwater Estates around her land in 2019, they promised the historical property would remain untouched. For 2 years, everything was fine. Then Patty Drummond was elected HOA president, and suddenly Margaret's quiet retirement became a battlefield of petty violations, threatening letters, and escalating demands. The dam invoice was just the latest assault in a campaign designed to force Margaret out. What Patty didn't know was that Margaret had spent her entire career fighting exactly these kinds of territorial disputes, armed with regulations, precedents, and an encyclopedic knowledge of property law. The peaceful retiree had tried reasoning, tried compromise, tried ignoring the harassment. But the dam bill crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The confrontation came at the monthly HOA meeting, where Patty expected to publicly humiliate Margaret into paying. Instead, Margaret arrived with a leather portfolio containing 78 years of documentation, 3 attorney friends, and a county records official she called in a favor from. What unfolded wasn't just a reversal of a fraudulent bill. It was a systematic dismantling of Patty's entire power structure, executed with the precision of someone who'd spent decades writing reports that ended careers. Margaret didn't raise her voice once. She didn't need to. Every document she presented was another nail in Patty's coffin. Every citation another reminder that expertise beats entitlement every single time. By the end of that meeting, Patty wasn't just wrong. She was exposed, humiliated, and facing consequences she never saw coming. The resolution brought changes that rippled through the entire community. Margaret's victory didn't just protect her property. It revealed a pattern of overreach that affected dozens of homeowners, sparked investigations that went far beyond one fraudulent bill, and ultimately transformed how the HOA operated. Patty's fate became a cautionary tale whispered at neighborhood barbecues. And Margaret? She finally got the peace she'd been seeking, along with something she hadn't expected: respect, gratitude, and proof that sometimes the quietest people carry the biggest hammers. Here's exactly how it happened. Margaret Chun had always been a builder, not a fighter. After earning her civil engineering degree from MIT in 1983, she'd spent 35 years with the Army Corps of Engineers, designing levees, bridges, and water management systems across the western United States. She'd worked on the Sacramento River Flood Control Project, consulted on dam safety assessments in Montana, and testified before Congress twice about infrastructure maintenance. When she retired in 2020 at 61, she'd been looking forward to finally spending time at the property her grandfather had homesteaded in 1945, the 5-acre lot in what was now the outskirts of Boulder, Colorado. Featured the original 1946 farmhouse her grandfather had built himself, a small stone dam he constructed in 1947 to create a fishing pond, and enough privacy to make Margaret forget about decades of bureaucratic battles. Her wife Sarah had passed away from cancer in 2018, and this quiet refuge represented everything Margaret needed to heal. No more conference calls, no more environmental impact reports, no more fighting. Just peace. The property had been Margaret's family for 76 years. When Clearwater Estates started construction in 2019, the developers had been respectful, even deferential. They'd recognized that Margaret's plot was grandfathered, and with historical property protections and water rights that predated any modern zoning. The original HOA board, elected in 2020, have been friendly. President Tom Morrison had even brought Margaret cookies and assured her the development would respect her boundaries. For 18 months, everything was fine. Margaret tended her garden, worked on restoring the old farmhouse, and occasionally waved to new neighbors who walked the community trail that skirted the edge of her property. She'd specifically granted an easement for that trail, wanting to be neighborly. That decision would come back to haunt her in March 2022. Tom Morrison moved out of state and Patty Drummond ran for HOA president unopposed. Patty was 48, a former pharmaceutical sales rep who'd moved to Clearwater, estates with her investment banker husband and 2 teenage daughters. She'd made her campaign about elevating property values and enforcing community standards. Margaret had met her once at the community coffee mixer and found her exhausting, the kind of person who interrupted others mid-sentence and spoke to everyone like they were particularly slow children. By April, Margaret started receiving violation notices. First, it was her non-compliant mailbox, even though her mailbox had been installed in 1947 and was explicitly exempted from HOA rules. Then it was her unapproved fence, a split-rail structure her grandfather had built in 1952. Each notice came with a fine $50, then $100, then $250. Margaret responded with copies of her property deed, her grandfather's original permits, and polite reminders that her land predated the HOA by 74 years. The notices kept coming anyway. In June, Patty sent a letter demanding Margaret remove her unauthorized garden shed within 30 days or face daily fines of $100. The shed in question was the original 1946 chicken coop her grandfather had built, now converted to tool storage. Margaret called Patty directly, kept her voice calm and professional, and explained again that her property was not subject to HOA regulations. Patty's response was pure condescension. "Well, Margaret, I understand you're elderly and perhaps confused about how communities work, but we have standards here. Your ramshackle buildings are bringing down everyone's property values. Now, I'm trying to be nice about this, but if you continue to be difficult, we'll have no choice but to take legal action." Margaret, who'd been called elderly exactly once before by a 23-year-old contractor who'd immediately regretted it, ended the call without responding. She spent the next week documenting everything, creating a file she labeled HOA Drummond Harassment, and hoping things would settle down. They didn't settle down. They escalated. In August, Margaret returned from a week visiting her sister in Seattle to find a work crew on her property, hired by the HOA to trim overgrown vegetation that violate community aesthetics guidelines. They cut down 3 mature lilac bush her grandmother had planted in 1951, bush that produced the purple flowers Sarah had loved so much. Margaret stood in her driveway, staring at the stumps, shaking so hard she had to sit down on the porch steps. When she called Patty, the HOA president's response was cheerful. "Oh yes, we took care of that eyesore for you. You're welcome. You'll receive a bill for the landscaping service, of course. $1,200. Payment is due within 15 days. Margaret hung up without speaking, walked inside, and for the first time since Sarah's funeral, cried from pure rage. She tried the proper channels first. Margaret filed a formal complaint with the HOA board, attended the September meeting, and presented her case calmly and professionally. She brought her original property deed, dated December 1945. She brought county records showing her grandfather's permits for the dam, dated March 1947. She brought the easement agreement she'd voluntarily granted for the trail, which explicitly stated it conferred no other rights to the HOA. She brought photographs of her property from the 1950s, 1970s, and 2000s, showing that nothing had changed. Patty listened with a smirk, then interrupted. Margaret, sweetheart, I appreciate this little history lesson, but rules are rules. Your property is within Clearwater Estates boundaries, which means HOA regulations apply. If you can't afford to maintain the standards, perhaps it's time to consider selling to someone who can. 3 board members looked uncomfortable but said nothing. 2 others nodded along with Patty. The vote went 4-2-2 to uphold all fines and demand payment within 30 days. Margaret tried calling the county zoning office, but got caught in bureaucratic loops that went nowhere. She tried contacting a lawyer, but the retainer fees would have cost more than just paying the fraudulent fines. She even tried reaching out to other Clearwater Estates residents, hoping to find allies who might help vote Patty out. What she discovered was worse than apathy. It was fear. 3 different neighbors confided that Patty had targeted them too with baseless fines and threats. One had paid $4,000 rather than fight. Another had sold their house and moved. A third was currently locked in a legal battle that was draining their retirement savings. Patty Drummond had turned the HOA into her personal fiefdom, and nobody knew how to stop her. Then on Tuesday, November 15th, the dam invoice arrived. $3,000 for unauthorized use of HOA water, resources, and mandatory dam maintenance fees. The letter explained that the pond created by Margaret's dam provided aesthetic and recreational value to the Clearwater Estates community, and therefore Margaret owed retroactive fees dating back to the HOA's formation in 2020, plus annual maintenance assessments going forward. The invoice included a payment schedule and a threat: pay within 15 days or face foreclosure proceedings on her property for unpaid HOA dues. Margaret read the document sitting at her kitchen table, the same table where her grandfather had sat in 1947, planning how to build that dam with his own hands and his neighbor's help. She thought about Sarah, who'd loved his place, who made Margaret promise to keep it in the family. She thought about her grandfather, who'd survived the Depression and World War II and built something lasting with his bare hands. And she thought about Patty Drummond, who'd waltzed into a ready-made community 2 years ago and decided to become its tyrant. Margaret pulled out her laptop and started making phone calls. Not to lawyers this time, to old colleagues, to people who owed her favors from 35 years of government work, to the county records office where she'd helped expedite permits for a friend's nephew 5 years ago, to the Colorado Division of Water Resources where her former assistant director now worked, to 3 attorney friends who specialized in property law and loved nothing more than taking down bullies. She spent 3 weeks building her case the way she built infrastructure projects foundation first, every detail checked, every citation verified, every possible counterargument anticipated. She pulled deeds and permits and water rights documentation going back to 1882, when the original homesteader first claimed this land. She researched HOA law, Colorado property statutes, and found 6 separate precedents that would obliterate Patty's position. She created a timeline of harassment that read like a prosecution file, and she discovered something absolutely beautiful in the county records. A clerical error from 2019 that meant Clearwater Estates' official boundaries didn't actually include Margaret's property at all. On December 8th, Margaret received an email from Patty scheduling a special hearing at the next HOA meeting to address Margaret's continued. Non-compliance and outstanding debts totaling $6,400. The email was copied to all Clearwater Estates residents and the HOA's attorney. It accused Margaret of being a hostile neighbor who was exploiting legal technicalities and refusing to contribute to community welfare. It strongly implied that Margaret, as an elderly widow, might be experiencing cognitive decline that prevented her from understanding civic obligations. The email ended with a thinly veiled threat. "We hope Miss Chin will see reason, but the board is prepared to take all necessary legal action to protect our community's interests." Margaret read it twice, then called her attorney friends and her county records contact. "December 15th, she told them. "I'm going to need you all there, and I'm going to need you to bring everything." The Clearwater Estates HOA meeting room was packed on December 15th at 7 in the evening. Normally, these meetings drew maybe 15 people. Tonight, 63 residents crowded into the community center, drawn by Patty's email blast promising a resolution to a community issue affecting all property values. Patty sat at the head table with her 4 alive board members, wearing a cream-colored blazer and the satisfied expression of someone about to deliver a public execution. She'd even arranged for her attorney, Blake Morrison, no relation to the former president, to attend. The agenda listed Margaret's hearing as item 3, scheduled for 7:30. Margaret arrived at exactly 7:15, carrying a leather portfolio that had accompanied her to congressional hearings. She wore her navy blue suit, the professional armor she'd worn to every high-stakes meeting for 3 decades. Behind her walked 3 people Patty didn't recognize, 2 men in suits and a woman, carrying an official-looking folder with the Boulder County seal. Patty called the meeting to order with exaggerated formality, rushed through the first 2 agenda items in 9 minutes, then smiled at the assembled crowd. "Now we come to a matter that affects our entire community. Ms. Margaret Chun has repeatedly refused to comply with HOA regulations, has accumulated over $6,000 in fines and fees, and has most recently refused to pay for her use of community water resources. Tonight, we're here to give Ms. Sheehan one final opportunity to make this right before we proceed with foreclosure proceedings. Ms. Chun, would you like to address the board?" Her tone was that of a judge speaking to a convicted criminal before sentencing. Several residents shifted uncomfortably. A few looked sympathetic toward Margaret. Most just looked curious about what would happen next. Margaret stood, walked to the front of the room, and set her portfolio on the presentation table. She didn't look nervous. She looked like someone about to teach a master class. "Thank you, Ms. Drummond. I appreciate the opportunity to address these accusations publicly. Before I begin, I'd like to introduce my guests. This is Robert Chong, senior partner at Chong, Martinez & O'Brien, specializing in property law. This is Daniel Kowalski, also with Chong, Martinez & O'Brien. And this is Linda Brennan from the Boulder County Recorder of Deeds office. They're here to provide expert testimony and official documentation. I've also invited them because I believe in doing things properly, with witnesses and official records. Unlike some people." She said it calmly, looking directly at Patty, whose smile had frozen slightly. Blake Morrison, the HOA's attorney, looked suddenly alert, leaning forward with a frown. Margaret opened her portfolio and pulled out the first document. "Let's start with the dam invoice that prompted this meeting. The Clearwater Estates HOA has billed me $3,000 for, and I quote, unauthorized use of HOA water resources and dam maintenance fees. This bill claims that I owe retroactive fees for a dam that the HOA maintains provides community value. There are several problems with this claim. Let me address them in order." She pulled out a photograph, placed it on the document camera that projected onto the screen behind her. The image showed a man in 1940s work clothes standing beside a half-built stone structure. "This is my grandfather, James Chun, in July 1947, building the dam in question. He built it entirely on his own property, using stone quarried from his own land, with help from his neighbor Walt Morrison, Tom Morrison's grandfather, as it happens. The dam was completed in September 1947, creating what we call Chun's Pond. Here's the permit application. Filed with Boulder County on March 14th. 1,947 approved on March 30th. 1,947. Here's the water rights certification, granted on June 2nd, 1947. Establishing my family's perpetual right to impound water from the seasonal creek that runs through our property. She placed each document on the camera as she spoke, giving the audience time to see the dates, the official seals, the signatures of long-dead county officials. Patty's expression had progressed from frozen smile to genuine confusion. "Miss Chun," she interrupted, "this is all very interesting history, but it doesn't change the fact that the dam now provides value to our entire community, and you should contribute to its maintenance." Margaret turned to look at her, and several residents later said the look she gave Patty could have frozen lava. "I wasn't finished. Ms. Drummond, please don't interrupt me again." Patty's mouth opened, closed, opened again. She looked to Blake Morrison, who was studying his own papers with sudden intensity, clearly realizing he'd been given incomplete information. Margaret continued, "The dam sits entirely on my property. Here's the original property survey from 1945, when my grandfather homesteaded this land. Here's the survey from 1968, when property lines were formalized. Here's the survey from 2019, when Clearwater Estates was platted. Notice that my 5 acres were explicitly excluded from the development plat. Notice this notation here that says historical property, water rights established 1947, not subject to HOA covenants." She zoomed in on the notation. Several residents were now taking out their phones to photograph the screen. Margaret pulled out another document. Here's the water rights claim for the entire Clearwater Estates development, filed in 2019. Notice what it doesn't include: any claim to Chun's Pond or the dam that creates it. The developer specifically excluded my water rights because he knew, and I confirmed. Listened to a phone call with him last week that my family's claim predates his by 72 years and is legally untouchable. Patty stood up abruptly. "This is ridiculous. Your property is surrounded by Clearwater Estates. You benefit from our roads, our landscaping, our security. You need to pay your fair share." Margaret smiled, and it wasn't a friendly expression. "I'm glad you brought that up, Ms. Drummond. Let's discuss boundaries and jurisdiction, shall we?" She nodded to Linda Brennan, the county recorder, who stood and approached the screen with her own document folder. Linda's voice was professionally neutral, but carried authority. "I'm Linda Brennan, Deputy County Recorder for Boulder County. Miss Chung contacted me 3 weeks ago with a question about the legal boundaries of Clearwater Estates HOA. What we discovered was quite interesting." She pulled out a large map, placed it on the camera. "This is the official plat map for Clearwater Estates, filed with the county in 2019. These red lines indicate the HOA's legal boundaries as recorded in our system. You'll notice at the Chun property, these 5 acres here in green falls completely outside the red boundary lines." The room erupted. Multiple people started talking at once. Patty's face had gone pale. "That's impossible," she said, but her voice wavered. "We send her notices. Her mailbox is on our street. The trail goes past her property." Linda Brennan's expression didn't change. "The trail exists via an easement. Miss Chun voluntarily granted in 2020. An easement confers a specific right of passage. It does not confer membership in the HOA, does not subject the grantor's property to HOA regulations, and certainly doesn't give the HOA authority to charge fees or impose fines. As for her mailbox being on your street, I'd note that Clearwater Estates Drive is actually a public road maintained by the county, not a private street. Ms. Chun pays property taxes that fund that road. The HOA pays nothing toward its maintenance." Margaret let that sink in for a moment, watching Patty and her board members exchange panicked glances. Then she moved in for what she'd later described to her sister as the kill shot. "So let's review. The HOA has no legal authority over my property. The dam you billed me for was built 76 years ago by my family, sits on my land, and uses water rights I own outright. You've charged me over $6,000 in fines and fees that have zero legal basis. But here's where things get really interesting. She pulled out a thick stack of papers. Over the past 3 weeks, I've documented every interaction I've had with you. Miss Drummond, I've also spoken with 17 other Clearwater Estates residents who've been targeted by your aggressive interpretation of HOA authority. Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, would you stand up? An elderly couple in the third row stood hesitantly. Margaret gestured to them. The Pattersons received a $2,000 fine for their non-compliant roof color, even though their roof color was explicitly approved by the Architectural Committee before installation. When they showed Ms. Drummond the approval letter, she told them the committee had made an error and they'd have to pay to repaint anyway. They paid rather than fight. Mrs. Washington, please stand. A black woman in her 40s stood up, looking angry. Mrs. Washington received violations for her excessive holiday decorations, a single wreath on her door, and 2 potted poinsettias. She received escalating fines totaling $1,500 over 3 weeks, with threats of foreclosure if she didn't pay. She paid. Mr. Kowalski, are these actions legally defensible? Daniel Kowalski stood, and his voice carried the weight of 30 years of courtroom experience. No, the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CC&RS, are publicly recorded documents. I've reviewed them. Patty Drummond has violated the HOA's own rules repeatedly. The Patterson situation violates the Architectural Committee's authority and the appeals process. The Washington case is arguably discriminatory harassment, particularly given that other residents have similar decorations without violations. And Ms. Chun's situation constitutes fraud, illegal fee assessment, and harassment. He paused for effect. If Ms. Chin were to file suit, she'd have grounds for compensatory damages, punitive damages, and attorney's fees. If Mrs. Washington joined that suit, she'd add civil rights violations to the complaint. If the Pattersons joined, we'd establish a pattern of illegal conduct. I'd estimate collective damages north of $200,000. The room exploded in the conversation. Multiple residents started shouting questions. 3 people were on their phones, presumably texting others or looking up information. Blake Morrison, the HOA's attorney, looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. He stood up and said loudly, "I need to consult with my clients." I motion we table this matter. But Margaret wasn't done. "One more thing," she said, and the room quieted again. "Ms. Drummond, you've spent 18 months threatening foreclosure against me and others. You've claimed the authority to place liens on properties, to charge arbitrary fees, to assess fines without proper process. But according to Colorado law, an HOA can only foreclose for unpaid assessments after following very specific procedures. Those procedures include proper notice, a hearing before the board with the homeowner present, a vote recorded in official minutes, and a 30-day cure period. You follow exactly none of those steps for any of your targets. That's not incompetence. That's intentional misconduct." She turned to address the full room. "I spent 35 years as a civil engineer for the Army Corps of Engineers. I've testified before Congress. I've reviewed thousands of contracts, permits, and regulatory documents. I tried to resolve this quietly because I'm retired and I just want peace. But Ms. Drummond has made a career out of bullying people who don't know their rights, who can't afford lawyers, or who are just too tired to fight back. So I'm going to say this once publicly, with witnesses." She looked directly at Patty. "You have no authority over my property. You owe me a written apology and full reimbursement for the 3 lilac bush your contractor destroyed. That's $400. You will rescind every fine and fee you've charged me. You will send a formal letter to every Clearwater Estates resident explaining that you exceeded your authority and that any fines paid under your administration will be reviewed for refund. And you will resign from the HOA board immediately." Patty finally found her voice, though it came out strangled. "You can't make me resign. I was elected." Margaret smiled. "You're right. I can't make you resign. But Mr. Chang here can file suit tomorrow morning for fraud, harassment, and illegal fee assessment. Mrs. Washington can add a civil rights complaint. The Pattersons and the others can join a class action. And I promise you, Ms. Drummond, I have the documentation, the expert witnesses, and the resources to pursue this case until you don't just resign, you're financially ruined. Or you can resign tonight, apologize, and we can all move forward. You have 2 minutes to decide." The room was silent, except for the buzz of the overhead lights and someone's phone vibrating repeatedly. Patty looked at Blake Morrison, who deliberately looked away, at her board members, who were studying the table, at her attorney, who was packing his briefcase. Then she looked back at Margaret, and whatever she saw in those calm, professional eyes made her shoulders slump. "I resign," she said quietly. Then louder, "I resign from the board, effective immediately. I apologize for any misunderstandings about my authority." Her voice cracked on the last word. Margaret nodded once. "Mr. Chang will contact you about reimbursements. Linda, could you please note in the official record that Patricia Drummond resigned from the Clearwater Estates HOA board on December 15th at 7:53 p.m.? Linda pulled out a form, made notes, had Patty sign it. The meeting adjourned 10 minutes later in chaos, with multiple residents surrounding Margaret to ask questions, share their own stories, and thank her. Patty Drummond left through the side door without speaking to anyone. 3 weeks later, on January 7th, Margaret received a certified check for $400 covering the destroyed lilac bush, along with a brief typed letter of apology from Patty Drummond. The letter was one paragraph, obviously written by Patty's lawyer, and contained no admission of intentional wrongdoing. Margaret deposited the check and filed the letter. Good enough. What mattered more was what happened in the aftermath of that December 15th meeting. Within 48 hours, Margaret had been contacted by 11 different Clearwater Estates residents who'd been targeted by Patty's fee schemes. Robert Chang, her attorney friend, agreed to review all their cases pro bono as a favor to Margaret, then escalated 3 of them to formal complaints when he realized how egregious the violations were. Mrs. Washington's case became a Colorado Civil Rights Division investigation when she filed an official complaint documenting that she'd been the only black homeowner to receive holiday decoration violations despite similar or more extensive decorations on 19 other homes, all owned by white residents. The HOA board held an emergency election on January 3rd. Tom Morrison's mother, Janet Morrison, who'd been active in the original development planning committee, was elected president by unanimous vote. Her first act was to hire an independent auditor to review the HOA's finances under Patty's administration. What the auditor found was breathtaking in its scope. Over 18 months, Patty had collected over $78,000 in fines and fees from Clearwater Estates residents. Of that money, only $12,000 had been deposited into the HOA account. The remaining $66,000 had simply vanished. When confronted with the audit, Patty's attorney initially claimed the missing money had been spent on administrative costs, but couldn't produce receipts, invoices, or documentation of any kind. Janet Morrison filed a report with the Boulder County District Attorney's Office on January 12th. By January 20th, Patty Drummond was charged with embezzlement, fraud, and theft. Margaret watched these developments from her peaceful farmhouse with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because justice was being served. Sadness because it should never have gotten this far. One evening in late January, Janet Morrison came to visit, bringing homemade cookies and apologies. "My son told me what a good neighbor you were when he was president," Janet said, sitting in Margaret's living room with tea. "I'm so sorry you had to go through all this. Patty approached me when she first ran for president, asked for my endorsement. I thought she seemed enthusiastic and organized. I didn't realize she was a crook. Margaret smiled. You couldn't have known. People like her are good at hiding what they are. They target the vulnerable elderly people, new immigrants, anyone who doesn't know the system well enough to fight back. The scary thing is how close she came to succeeding. The legal process moved slowly but inexorably forward. In February, Margaret learned that Patty's husband had filed for divorce. The couple's house in Clearwater Estates went up for sale in March, listed at a price that suggested financial desperation. By April, Robert Chang had negotiated settlements for 7 of the residents he was representing, with the HOA's insurance covering the reimbursements, plus damages. Mrs. Washington's civil rights case was settled out of court in May for an undisclosed amount. But Margaret heard through Janet that it was substantial enough that Mrs. Washington had retired from her nursing job and was planning to start her own business. The Patterson case went to arbitration in June and resulted in a complete refund of their fees plus $15,000 in damages for emotional distress and the cost of needlessly repainting their roof twice, Patty's criminal case dragged through the system until September, when she accepted a plea deal, restitution of the full $66,000 plus interest, 3 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and a permanent ban from serving on any HOA board in Colorado. Margaret attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the back row of the courtroom. Patty looked diminished somehow, smaller than she'd seen at that December HOA meeting. When the judge asked if she had anything to say, Patty read from a prepared statement apologizing to the Clearwater Estates community. Her voice was flat, mechanical. She didn't look at anyone in the courtroom. Margaret felt no triumph watching it, just a tired sense of closure. This woman had made so many people's lives miserable, had stolen money that families had saved for emergencies, and now she was getting a slap on the wrist probation and restitution she probably couldn't afford. But it was something. It was accountability. The changes to the HOA itself were more lasting and more meaningful. Janet Morrison, with input from residents, including Margaret, completely rewrote the HOA's enforcement procedures. Now, any fine over $100 required a formal hearing with the homeowner present. All fines had to be approved by a vote of the full board, with minutes recorded and made available all residents. The HOA established a resident advocacy committee to review complaints about board overreach. They hired a professional management company to handle finances, with mandatory quarterly audits. And they amended the CC&RS to explicitly state that historical properties with documentation predating the development were exempt from architectural guidelines. Margaret helped draft that last amendment, wanting to make sure no future board member could try what Patty had attempted. By October, Clearwater Estates had transformed from a community living in fear of arbitrary authority into something closer to what the original developers had envisioned: a neighborhood where people actually knew each other, helped each other, and governed themselves democratically. Margaret noticed a difference in small ways. People waved when she walked her property line. Kids playing on the community trail would stop to pet her dog and chat. In November, Janet organized a community potluck, and 78 families attended. Margaret brought her grandmother's dumpling recipe, and 3 different people asked if she'd be willing to serve on the architectural review committee, given her engineering background. She politely declined, but suggested they could call her for technical consultation if needed, on a cold Saturday morning in late November, almost exactly 1 year after the dam invoice had arrived. Margaret stood by Chun's pond watching ice crystals form along the edges of the water. She'd spent the morning planting new lilac bush near the house, 3 varieties her grandmother had loved. The bushes wouldn't bloom until spring, but Margaret liked knowing they were there, replacing what had been destroyed. Her sister was visiting for Thanksgiving, currently inside making coffee and complaining cheerfully about the farmhouse's drafty windows. The community trail was busy with morning walkers, and several people called out greetings as they passed. A year ago, Margaret had been facing foreclosure threats over a dam her grandfather had built with his own hands. Now, she was standing by that same dam on property that was unquestionably, legally, permanently hers. In a community that had learned the hard way that authority without accountability is just tyranny with a gavel, Margaret pulled out her phone and took a photo of the pond with the morning sun turning the ice gold at the edges. She sent it to Robert Chon with the caption, "Justice looks pretty good in winter." He responded 30 seconds later with a smiley face and "Damn right it does. See what I did there?" Margaret laughed out loud, startling a pair of ducks that had been paddling near the shore. Then she turned and walked back toward the house, toward her sister's coffee and her grandmother's recipe cards and her grandfather's legacy, toward everything we're protecting and everything she'd successfully protected. Because justice, whether delivered in a courtroom or an HOA meeting, hot with fresh evidence or cold with decades-old deeds, was equally satisfying when you served it yourself with precision, preparation, and the absolute certainty that you were right. Across the country in Portland, Maine, 63-year-old retired FBI forensic accountant David Park was renovating the Victorian home he'd bought at auction with his new neighbor. Real estate investor Kyle Brennan, 42, appeared on his porch with a contract demanding David pay $12,000 for shared driveway maintenance and repair costs. The problem? David's property had its own separate driveway that Kyle had never used and had no legal access to. When David politely declined, Kyle smiled and said, "Look, old man, I flip houses for a living. I know every trick in the book. You're going to pay, or I'm going to make your life miserable until you do." What Kyle didn't know was that David had spent 28 years tracking financial crimes for the FBI, had testified in 14 federal fraud cases, and could trace money through shell corporations in his sleep. When Kyle mentioned he flipped houses for a living, David's trained instincts kicked in. That evening, David pulled Kyle's property records, business filings, and tax liens. What he found made him smile for the first time since retirement. Kyle Brennan wasn't just a bad neighbor. He was running a mortgage fraud scheme that would make a perfect case study. And David still had friends at the Bureau who'd be very interested in his findings. But that's a story for another time.